Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Hunter, 38, and I've spent the last few years watching my life fall apart in ways I never imagined. When my marriage ended, it wasn't messy in a fun, dramatic TV show kind of way. It was crushing. My ex-wife smiled like she'd been waiting for this exact moment as she signed the final papers, and as I handed over the last of our joint savings, she didn't even glance at me. "You'll never recover," she said, her tone calm, almost bored, as if she were reading a script. At the time, I had no idea how right she was. Within weeks, I was living out of my car, alternating between parking lots and cheap motels, trying to keep my job and my dignity intact, and failing at both. Family was supposed to be the safety net, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But my family, well, let's just say they weren't exactly cheering me on. My parents always had favorites, and I wasn't it. Not that I mattered much in their eyes. My younger sister, Amanda, was the golden one, the one they bragged about at every family dinner. Me? I was just the guy who tried too hard and never quite measured up. And they made sure I knew it. There were little digs here and there. A raised eyebrow when I mentioned a promotion I got at work, a dismissive laugh when I told them I had bought a small place in the suburbs years ago, back when I had money. Nothing major, just enough to leave a sting that stayed long after the conversation ended. It had all started subtly, the pattern of them undermining me. But the more my ex-wife left me in ruins, the louder their amusement got. They didn't call to check in, didn't offer a place to crash. Instead, I get texts like, "Hope you're surviving out there, Liam." Or worse, sarcastic emails reminding me of my poor life choices. Even my sister would post pictures on social media of her lavish vacations and family gatherings, the captions dripping with smugness. "We missed you last weekend," they'd write, like it was some joke I was supposed to laugh at. And yet, there was a strange part of me that refused to give up, a stubborn streak I'd inherited from my grandfather. Maybe it was just survival instinct, or maybe it was pride. I didn't know. What I did know was that every night I sat in my car, the city lights glinting off the dashboard, I was thinking about how the world had written me off, and how I wasn't going to stay down forever. I wasn't naive. I knew my family would keep trying to step on me, and I knew my ex-wife would enjoy every bit of my struggle. But I also knew something else. They hadn't seen what I was capable of when backed into a corner. The turning point came on an unusually cold Thursday evening. I was parked near a gas station, shivering and eating a cold sandwich, my coat pulled tight around me, when someone tapped my shoulder. I jumped, nearly dropping my bag onto the concrete. I turned slowly and met the eyes of a woman in her late 40s, professional looking, with an envelope in hand. "Are you Liam Reynolds?" she asked. I nodded, wary. "Yes, who wants to know?" She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of friendly smile you get from a stranger. It was knowing, deliberate, like she held some secret meant only for me. "Your uncle in New York," she said, holding up the envelope like it weighed nothing, "left you his penthouse, his rare car collection, and $50 million. I laughed nervously. 50 million? I didn't even have 10 in my bank account. The idea felt surreal, like something out of a movie. My mind raced. Why me? Uncle Richard had always been distant, barely present at family events. And yet here he was, through this woman, handing me what could only be described as a small fortune. "And there's one rule," she added, her tone dropping, sharp and serious, and my stomach clenched. "One rule you must follow exactly. Break it, and everything disappears." She leaned closer, her eyes locking on mine. "You have to take control of your life, Hunter," she whispered. "Not just survive, own it. And to do that, you'll have to face your family in ways you never imagined." My hands shook as I held the envelope. I couldn't tell if it was excitement, fear, or the remnants of years of resentment rising up all at once. For a brief moment, I imagined showing up at the next family dinner, sitting there while they laughed at me, and knowing, just knowing, that I now had a way to rewrite every interaction, every insult, every dismissive glance they'd ever thrown my way. I could almost feel the weight of the penthouse keys in my pocket, the roar of engines from the rare cars, the quiet assurance that the world had tilted back in my favor. But even as I dreamed of revenge, I felt the chill settle back into my bones. I had no plan, no idea how to navigate this inheritance or the strings attached to it. The woman's eyes seemed to read my mind. "You'll need patience," she said, "and timing. The people who hurt you the most will think you're still beneath them. That's when you hit. Smart, precise, and unforgettable." Then she handed me the envelope and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with the wind, the neon lights, and a sense of possibility that was almost frightening. Sitting there, staring at the envelope, I thought about my ex-wife and the smug look on her face as she took everything from me. I thought about my family, their quiet mockery, and the years they'd spent making me feel small. And I realized, for the first time in a long while, that maybe I didn't have to crawl out of this. Maybe I didn't have to be the guy they thought they'd crushed. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn the tables. And that's when I made the decision. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to rise, and when the time came, they would remember the day they underestimated me. But I had to be careful, patient. I had to set everything up perfectly. The penthouse, the cars, the fortune, they were tools, not weapons, and my plan would have to be meticulous. There would be no mistakes. Because if I stumbled, it wouldn't just be me who lost. It would be the chance to make everyone who had laughed at me regret it for the rest of their lives. The wind howled against the car, rattling the windows, and I tucked the envelope under my arm like a lifeline. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the next day, or the week after that. All I knew was that my life was about to change. And when it did, I would make sure that everyone who had ever looked down on me understood exactly what it meant to be Hunter Reynolds. After that night with the woman and the envelope, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. I had this incredible lifeline in my hands, but the thought of using it recklessly terrified me. The past few years had taught me that rushing into things never ended well, and this was bigger than anything I had ever faced. So, I stayed low, watched, and waited. I continued living out of my car for a few more weeks, keeping my job at the small consulting firm I had managed to hang on to after the divorce, all the while planning. During that time, my family's behavior escalated. I hadn't expected it, but they seemed to sense my weakness even more acutely now, almost as if my vulnerability were fuel for their amusement. Thanksgiving was the first real turning point. My parents invited me over, a rare gesture that made me suspicious immediately. "It's been too long since we had the whole family together," my mom had said, her eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite read. My dad, ever the silent enabler, just nodded, his smirk hidden behind a glass of wine. Amanda was there too, of course, dressed in a designer outfit that seemed custom-made to make me feel every bit of inadequacy I'd felt growing up. The night started civil enough, polite small talk, awkward smiles, but it didn't take long for the familiar digs to surface. My mom commented on my suit, which I'd bought secondhand. "Hunter, that's a unique choice," she said, letting the word hang like a judgment. Amanda chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet but sharp enough to sting. "Well, at least he's trying, right? Some people just don't quite get it." I forced a laugh, tried to let it slide, but the tension was palpable. Then came the moment that made my blood boil. My dad, who rarely spoke unless he was criticizing, leaned over and said, "Hunter, why don't you just take some notes from Amanda? She's really figured out how to make things work. Maybe you could learn something." The words were casual, almost offhand, but the implication was clear. I was the failure, the one who couldn't measure up. And they all laughed lightly, as if it were a shared joke at my expense. I wanted to speak up, to tell them how wrong they were, but I didn't. I held my tongue because deep down, I knew they wouldn't understand. They weren't interested in my growth or my struggle. They were interested in reinforcing the narrative that I was always the one falling behind. That night, I drove home in silence, the city streets illuminated by passing headlights, thinking about all the times I had hoped they'd see me, truly see me, and realized they never would. Not without consequences. The following weeks were worse. Every interaction became a minefield. I'd receive texts from my mom criticizing my spending, my wardrobe, even my hair. Amanda posted increasingly smug photos of her new apartment, new car, new boyfriend. each one a reminder that she was thriving while I was scraping by. And then, the betrayal that changed everything happened. I had been quietly saving a small amount from my job, enough to finally rent a modest apartment, a step toward independence, a foothold toward reclaiming my life. I found a one-bedroom in the city, slightly overpriced but manageable, and was ecstatic. I called my parents to tell them, hoping for a shred of support. My dad picked up, and I could hear Amanda laughing in the background. "Hunter, that's cute," he said, the word dripping with condescension. "But did you think to check with Amanda first? She's looking at places nearby, and it would be unfortunate to overlap." I froze, confusion and anger twisting in my stomach. "Wait, what do you mean?" I asked. "Oh, nothing," my mom said, her voice suddenly sweet and disarming. "Just that you know, Amanda's opinion matters. We wouldn't want her to feel like you're intruding." I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room. They weren't just dismissing me. They were actively sabotaging me, making sure I never had the space to succeed without interference. That night, sitting in my car again because I had nowhere else to go, I felt something break inside me. I realized I had been fighting for recognition from people who weren't capable of giving it. They didn't see me as a son, a brother, or even a person. They saw me as a convenient punchline, an example of what not to be. The betrayal wasn't just the apartment. It was the accumulation of years of favoritism, subtle cruelty, and now active obstruction. It was the realization that my family had been undermining me at every turn, not out of malice alone, but because it gave them a sense of superiority. They thrived on my struggles, and every attempt I made to assert myself was met with ridicule or obstruction. And then came the day that broke me entirely. My ex-wife had been avoiding me, as usual, until she realized I was surviving, barely, and she wanted to rub it in. She invited me to lunch under the guise of closure, a meeting that was anything but. Sitting across from her in that overpriced cafe, she smiled that same smug smile she had on the day she left me, and casually mentioned she'd heard about my little apartment adventure. "Funny," she said, stirring her coffee. "I was thinking of buying the building you were looking at. It's a shame you'll never have it." I couldn't respond. There was no comeback that would pierce her veneer of satisfaction. I walked out, head spinning, heart pounding. The betrayal hit me in layers. My family, my ex, the city itself that seemed to conspire against me. And in that moment, something in me snapped. I realized I couldn't just survive anymore. I needed a plan, a strategy, a way to turn the tables completely. That's when I started thinking about my uncle's inheritance, the penthouse, the cars, the fortune waiting for me. It wasn't just a windfall, it was a weapon. And if I played it right, I could do more than just reclaim my life. I could make them understand, make them feel the sting of underestimating me. But first, I needed patience. I needed to gather information, learn the family dynamics in detail, and find their weaknesses. My ex-wife thought she had one. My parents thought they had the upper hand. Amanda thought she was untouchable, but they were all wrong. I began documenting everything: conversations, social media posts, little slights and insults, patterns of behavior. I kept receipts, emails, anything that showed how much they tried to diminish me. Each note, each observation, fueled my determination. I wasn't just angry, I was calculating. And for the first time in a long while, I felt powerful, like I had a purpose beyond mere survival. One night, I parked outside Amanda's apartment. It felt almost sinister, but I wasn't there to cause trouble, yet. I just watched, noting her comings and goings, the people she surrounded herself with. I realized just how insulated she was, how convinced she was that she had the world figured out, that I was beneath notice. And that arrogance, that overconfidence, was going to be her downfall. The real breaking point came at Christmas, during what was supposed to be a family dinner. I showed up, dressed neatly, careful not to overdo it, but the moment I stepped inside, the tension was palpable. My parents exchanged glances. Amanda smiled that smug, knowing smile, and I felt the weight of years of mockery pressing down on me. The conversation started normally enough, but it wasn't long before they began their usual digs. "You're looking different, Hunter," my mom said, tilting her head. but that's probably just the cold weather." Amanda laughed. "Different isn't necessarily better," she added, and my father chuckled, echoing the sentiment. I wanted to snap, to tell them exactly what I thought of them, but I kept my composure. For the first time, I realized that my reaction would have more power if I stayed calm, if I let them underestimate me. Because the truth was, I had a secret they couldn't possibly comprehend. A fortune waiting, a chance to rewrite everything. And I wasn't about to let a single sarcastic comment or rolled eye ruin my strategy. By the time dessert came, I was silently seething, calculating, and planning. Amanda made a comment about my poor life choices and laughed, not realizing that every word was being stored away in my mind, part of the dossier of evidence and observations that would fuel the reckoning to come. I sat there, smiling politely, nodding, while the seed of revenge took root, growing into something I knew would be unstoppable. I left that night more determined than ever. The betrayal, the favoritism, the constant undermining, it had all pushed me to this point. I wasn't broken. I wasn't a failure. I was a man with the tools to reclaim everything, and I knew, deep down, that when the time came, no one in my family, not even my ex-wife, would be able to ignore me. They thought they had won, but the game had only just begun. And with that thought, I held the envelope tighter, knowing that the moment I had been waiting for, my chance to rise, to confront, to overturn the unfair world that had laughed at me, was coming closer with every passing day. After that Christmas dinner, I felt like I had hit a point I couldn't have imagined a few months prior. It wasn't just my ex-wife laughing at my misfortune anymore, or my parents' endless favoritism. It was the stark realization that the people I'd trusted most had spent years building walls between themselves and me, and I'd been blind to the fact that they weren't just indifferent, they actively sought to diminish me. I thought about that night sitting in my car after the cafe, holding my uncle's envelope, and for a brief moment, I almost let despair win. I almost thought maybe I had missed my chance to reclaim anything. But then I remembered something my grandfather once told me, years ago, back when I was a kid and already starting to feel like I could never measure up. The ones who underestimate you are the ones who will feel it the hardest when you rise. I held on to that thought and decided to change the narrative, starting from scratch. I didn't have an apartment yet, and my car was more of a makeshift bedroom than a vehicle. My ex had drained my finances and left me scrambling. It would have been easy to succumb to self-pity, but there was something about finally seeing the opportunity in my uncle's inheritance that sparked a stubborn resolve I didn't know I had. I realized that if I wanted to rise, I had to embrace humility first. I couldn't rush into luxury and expect it to solve all my problems. Patience would be key, so I started small. I accepted that I'd need to live frugally for a while, finding the cheapest motels and relying on my old car not just as a vehicle, but as a temporary home. I took on extra hours at work, even volunteering for projects that didn't offer recognition, just to rebuild credibility and keep my mind active. I focused on myself in ways I hadn't in years, sleeping regularly, exercising when I could, and taking care of my mental health. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing, quietly and deliberately. The loneliness was brutal, though. I had no one to celebrate the little victories with. Every time I managed to scrape together enough to afford a small meal or a quiet motel room for the night, it felt like a hollow accomplishment. The city outside my windshield was indifferent, busy with lives far more glamorous and stable than mine, and I felt invisible. Yet, in that invisibility, I found a strange freedom. No one was watching me. No one was judging me. I could plan, think, and rebuild without interference, without ridicule. And then came the first real step toward reclaiming control. The envelope from the woman, the one who had delivered the inheritance notice, had detailed instructions for accessing my uncle's assets. There were legal steps, letters, and a list of contacts I could reach out to discreetly. I realized that the penthouse, the cars, and the money weren't just assets, they were leverage. If I played it smart, I could transform not just my life but the dynamic with the people who had hurt me most. I started researching every detail meticulously, taking notes, organizing contacts, and quietly strategizing. During this time, My family continued their pattern of mockery and sabotage, unaware that the tides were shifting. Amanda's social media posts grew even more ostentatious. Designer clothes, luxury trips, extravagant dinners. But I no longer reacted emotionally. I observed. I cataloged. Every boastful post, every condescending comment, every sly jab became part of my mental dossier. My parents sent their usual text messages, alternating between backhanded advice and pointed reminders of my failures. My ex-wife, naturally, continued her campaign of subtle humiliation, occasionally mentioning purchases or events she'd made sure I'd miss, seemingly to remind me of everything I no longer had. And yet, amidst all that, I began to feel something I hadn't in years: power. Not the kind that comes from money or status, but the quiet, steady power of knowing I had options they couldn't even imagine. I could see the cracks in their armor, the arrogance that came from underestimating me. I knew that eventually, the moment would come when I could exploit those cracks, when I could show them what it meant to cross me. But first, I needed patience, discipline, and a plan that left nothing to chance. One night, I finally accessed a small portion of the inheritance, a bank account set up under my name, with enough to cover rent, a modest apartment, and a car that wasn't just functional but reliable. I felt like I was crawling out of a pit I'd been stuck in for years. The penthouse and rare cars were still out of reach, requiring legal verification and careful navigation. But even this small taste of financial freedom was intoxicating. For the first time, I could see a path not just to survival, but to thriving. I moved into the apartment slowly, treating it almost like a training ground. I organized my routines, mapped out my goals, and continued my observation of the family. Every time Amanda posted something online, I mentally noted patterns of behavior: her schedules, her social circles, her assumptions about my life. My parents continued to underestimate me, assuming I was still struggling, and I let them. Letting them underestimate me became a tool. I realized that the element of surprise would be my greatest weapon. Work became a sanctuary. I threw myself into projects with a renewed vigor, not for recognition, but to sharpen skills I could use later: negotiation, planning, organization. Slowly, carefully, I began networking, reaching out to people who could offer guidance on managing wealth and assets discreetly. I learned about legal structures for inheritance, asset protection, and even the fine points of luxury property management. Every piece of knowledge added another layer to the plan forming in my mind. There were setbacks, of course. A particularly brutal week involved car trouble, a heated confrontation with a neighbor over parking, and a nasty comment from my manager questioning my commitment. I could have crumbled, but I didn't. Instead, I treated each challenge as a rehearsal for what was coming. Each insult, each obstacle became fuel. I no longer feared them. I studied them, analyzed them, and turned them into preparation. One evening, I sat in my small living room, staring at the envelope and the stack of documents it contained. The penthouse, the cars, the fortune, they weren't just assets anymore. They were symbols. Symbols of what I could become if I played my cards right. Symbols of the reckoning that awaited the people who had made me feel small. Symbols of my own resilience and intelligence. I allowed myself a rare smile. I wasn't just Hunter Reynolds, the guy living out of his car. I was a man with a plan, a purpose, and a patience that would outlast everyone who had doubted me. I also began experimenting with subtle moves in my personal life, testing boundaries and observing reactions. I made small investments in side projects, things that seemed minor but were intended to establish credibility. I reconnected with old colleagues, casually mentioning new opportunities, gauging who would take me seriously and who would still assume I was the same struggling guy. The responses were illuminating. Some were dismissive, some intrigued, and some, like my ex-wife and family, remained arrogantly smug. Their dismissiveness told me exactly how much impact my eventual rise would have. The turning point came when I realized that my ex-wife, my parents, and Amanda had been operating under the assumption that I would always be desperate, always vulnerable, and always reactive. That assumption was no longer true. I was learning to move quietly, deliberately, and strategically. Every action I took, Every investment, every step toward independence, was a brick in the foundation of a life they would never see coming. And that foundation wasn't just for me. It was for the day I could confront them, not with anger or rashness, but with undeniable proof of my rise. One night, I sat in the apartment, looking out over the city lights, and allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought about every insult, every slight, every act of favoritism that had pushed me to this point. I realized that the anger I felt wasn't just about loss. It was about recognition, about finally proving to myself that I mattered. That evening, I made a promise. I would not rush. I would not act recklessly. I would rebuild quietly, meticulously, and when the time was right, I would reclaim everything. Not for revenge alone, but for validation, for proof that I could rise, despite everything. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Not naive hope, but a grounded, deliberate hope rooted in action and preparation. I wasn't just Hunter Reynolds, the guy everyone assumed was broken. I was Hunter Reynolds, the man quietly assembling the tools to rewrite his life. And the family who had dismissed, sabotaged, and laughed at me, they had no idea the storm that was coming. By the time spring arrived, I had transformed my life in ways that were almost imperceptible to anyone outside of me. The modest apartment had become a sanctuary, a base of operations, if you will, for plotting, planning, and quietly reclaiming control over everything that had been stolen from me. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't announcing my victories on social media, and I certainly wasn't looking for validation from the people who had spent years undermining me. I had learned the hard way that the world would only respect me if I demanded it through action, not words. The envelope from the woman remained tucked in a drawer, dog-eared, annotated, and memorized. I had taken painstaking notes on every instruction, every contact, every legal nuance my uncle had left me, and I had already begun implementing them subtly. I didn't touch the penthouse yet, didn't display any hint of wealth. My focus was precision, patience, and observation. Every move had to be calculated. One misstep could expose me before I was ready. I started by establishing credibility in circles that mattered. I reached out to trusted financial advisors, discreetly, using the documents as proof of my assets without revealing too much. I spoke with estate lawyers to clarify the exact stipulations of my uncle's will and the conditions tied to the inheritance. One misstep, I realized, and I could lose everything before the family even realized what was happening. Slowly, I learned how to maneuver with confidence, how to make decisions that would maximize impact when the time came. I wasn't just building wealth, I was building leverage. Observing my family became almost an obsession. I followed their social media accounts more closely than ever, but not just to see what they bought or where they traveled. I was looking for patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. Amanda's arrogance, my parents' complacency, my ex-wife's smugness, it all became data. They had all assumed I was beneath notice, and that arrogance was going to be my weapon. I learned when Amanda left her apartment unattended, when my mom's social calendar left her vulnerable to exposure, when my father's pride made him predictable. Every small detail added another layer to the strategy forming in my mind. The first breakthrough came when I discovered a minor legal loophole regarding one of the rare cars in my uncle's collection. It was a car my uncle had been particularly fond of, a limited edition model worth millions. According to the documents, it had to be maintained and insured before it could be transferred officially to me, but no one else knew about this requirement. That small technicality became a test case for how quietly and efficiently I could take control. I arranged for an appraiser and a transport company under the guise of standard maintenance, ensuring that by the time anyone in my family noticed, it would be too late to intervene. It was exhilarating to see the first tangible success of my plan. Meanwhile, my ex-wife continued her routine of petty humiliation. She would occasionally flaunt achievements or mention events she thought I'd never attend. One evening, she texted me about a gala she was attending, smugly noting the luxury accommodations and the exclusive crowd. I didn't respond. Instead, I made a note of the venue, the attendees, and the date. This was an opportunity to test how I could assert presence without showing the full extent of my newfound power. Every small victory became a rehearsal for the day when my family would finally understand that the man they had mocked for years was no longer beneath them. I also started reaching out quietly to people my family trusted or admired. Old colleagues of Amanda's, former business contacts of my parents, even the caterer they used for family events. I positioned myself not as a threat, but as someone quietly influential, someone who was building networks and credibility. By the time the confrontation came, I wanted allies in place who could observe, confirm, and, if necessary, participate in the unveiling of what I had become. This wasn't about revenge in the reckless sense. It was about creating undeniable proof of my success and intelligence, and letting the consequences speak for themselves. My personal transformation mirrored the professional one. I invested in my appearance subtly, nothing extravagant, but enough to communicate confidence and self-respect. I learned to walk into a room without hesitation, to speak with authority, to project competence even in casual conversation. My ex-wife and family had always underestimated the power of perception, and I planned to use it against them. Every interaction I had outside of my apartment became a chance to refine my presence, to test reactions, to build momentum without revealing my hand. By late spring, the groundwork was firmly laid. I had secured legal clarity on the inheritance, discreetly taken control of a portion of the assets, and mapped out a series of scenarios for how to confront my family. The most important element, I realized, was timing. Confront too early, and they dismiss it as luck or fluke. Wait too long, and the opportunity for maximum impact could be lost. I needed a perfect storm, an occasion where every slight, every insult, every act of favoritism and sabotage would culminate in undeniable reckoning. And then came the first real test of patience, a dinner at my parents' house for what they called family planning. Amanda had posted an Instagram story showing her excitement, tagging everyone in the family except me. My ex-wife, of course, had caught wind of it and sent a message, clearly expecting me to feel some pang of inadequacy. I didn't. I smiled at the message, noted the time and date, and marked it in my mental calendar. That dinner, it occurred to me, would be the perfect opportunity to begin the subtle play of presence and influence without revealing my full power. I arrived at the dinner quietly, deliberately underdressed compared to Amanda, who wore a designer dress that seemed designed to intimidate. My parents greeted me with polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. As the evening progressed, they made all the usual remarks, the backhanded compliments, the subtle digs, the thinly veiled judgments. But I remained calm, composed, observant. Every joke, every comment, every raised eyebrow became data for the larger plan. I didn't respond emotionally. I responded strategically. I let them underestimate me, let them assume I was still the struggling, pitiful son they'd always thought I was. After dinner, as the night wound down, Amanda made a particularly sharp comment about my inability to keep up with the family standard, laughing in a way that was meant to wound. Normally, I would have felt my anger spike, but now I simply nodded politely, smiling. Inside, though, I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that she had no idea I had begun quietly consolidating wealth, influence, and information that would one day put me in a position she could never ignore. I realized in that moment that her arrogance, my parents' complacency, and my ex-wife's smugness were not obstacles. They were fuel. The more they underestimated me, the stronger my position became. By the end of the night, I had a clear vision. One carefully orchestrated series of moves, timed perfectly, would allow me to reveal my transformation in a way that was undeniable, impactful, and irreversible. The penthouse would be secured, the cars would be displayed subtly, and the fortune would no longer be a secret. My ex-wife would finally see that her smug dismissal of my struggles had been premature. My parents would confront the reality that their favoritism and neglect had created a man they could not control, and Amanda would finally understand that arrogance and entitlement were no shield against skill, patience, and intelligence. As I drove back to my apartment that night, The city lights reflected off the windshield, and I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The setup was nearly complete. Every ally, every asset, every observation was in place. I allowed myself a private smile, thinking of the first subtle ways I would begin shifting the power dynamic without revealing the full extent of my rise. They had assumed I was weak, desperate, and reactive. They were about to learn that patience, planning, and quiet determination were far more formidable weapons than they had ever imagined. And with that realization, I made a promise to myself. I would not rush. I would not act impulsively. I would wait for the perfect moment, and when it came, everything would change. The family who had mocked, sabotaged, and dismissed me for years would finally understand that Hunter Reynolds was no longer the man they thought he was. And when the time came, the reveal would be precise, unstoppable, and unforgettable. The night I had been planning for months finally arrived, and everything had to unfold flawlessly. By this point, I had secured legal control over my uncle's penthouse, the rare car collection, and a significant portion of the inheritance. The rest would follow through quietly, after the family had experienced the first wave of consequences. I hadn't rushed, hadn't bragged, hadn't made a single move that would alert them. Every observation, every tiny step I'd taken, the quiet consolidation of power, the research, the patience, was about to pay off in a way that would be unmistakable, unforgettable. I sent the invitations carefully, targeting the people who mattered most to the family's perception of social standing. It was presented as a private gathering, a casual dinner to celebrate the acquisition of a property. Every detail was deliberate. The penthouse gleaming in the upper floors of Manhattan, rare cars parked in the private garage, a selection of food and wine that communicated quiet luxury without ostentation. I wanted the contrast to speak louder than any words. My ex-wife had been invited under the guise of reconciliation, my parents and Amanda under the idea that they were witnessing a simple family milestone. When they arrived, the first reaction was priceless. My parents' eyes went wide at the sight of the penthouse, the art, the impeccably curated decor. Amanda gasped audibly, her posture rigid, her smug smile nowhere in sight. My ex-wife's reaction was the most delicious, the faintest flicker of shock, quickly masked by a smug attempt at composure. But the eyes told the truth. She had not expected this. "Wow," my mom said, trying to maintain calm, but her voice shook slightly. This is... Hunter, is this really yours?" I smiled politely, calmly, deliberately. "Yes," I said. "Everything here. And everything you thought I couldn't achieve. The cars, the property, the accounts, they're all under my name. All legal. All mine." Amanda's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again, but no words came. My dad's usual smug, controlling demeanor faltered, replaced by visible discomfort. They hadn't anticipated competence, much less absolute control. They had assumed I would always be beneath notice, but here I was, seated at the center of what had once been their world of superiority, now mine. The first subtle blow came when I guided them down to the garage. Each car was a rare model, some of them so limited that collectors would have paid millions for a chance to own them. Amanda reached for a phone, probably to text a friend, but I stopped her with a look. "They're not for sale," I said simply, letting the finality of the statement sink in. "You can look, but nothing leaves this property without my approval." I watched her falter, realizing for the first time that her assumptions about entitlement and ownership no longer applied. My ex-wife tried to regain composure, saying, "Technically, you inherited this," but I let her trail off. I wasn't angry. I didn't need to raise my voice. My calm, quiet control, and the sheer scale of what they were witnessing spoke louder than any argument I could make. Dinner that night was a masterclass in subtle psychological domination. I engaged them in casual conversation, peppered with facts and anecdotes that revealed knowledge they didn't know I had acquired. I spoke of investments, legal nuances, and future opportunities in ways that suggested competence, intelligence, and confidence, all while maintaining politeness. Every question they asked was met with a measured, precise response. The more they tried to assert superiority or dismiss me, the more they revealed their desperation, their inability to process that I had risen far beyond their petty expectations. Amanda made the mistake of commenting on my luck in inheriting the assets. I let her speak, then gently corrected her. It wasn't luck, I said softly, almost conversationally. It was preparation, knowledge, patience, and yes, paying attention to the details that most people overlook. The words hit her harder than any insult could have. She understood, in that moment, that I had outmaneuvered her, not with anger, but with intelligence and strategy. My parents tried to salvage dignity by suggesting that my success was temporary, that circumstances could change. I nodded politely. Of course, I said. But the preparation, the understanding, the work I've put in, those aren't temporary. They're mine. That's what matters. The silence that followed was almost tangible. They realized, with mounting horror, that no fortune, no favor, no manipulation could undo the disciplined, deliberate path I had forged. The real moment of triumph came later that evening, when I revealed the final piece of my plan: access to my uncle's primary accounts, legal documentation proving my control over all assets, and an agreement that allowed me to oversee any transactions the family had previously assumed they could influence. Watching the realization spread across their faces, seeing the shift from smugness to disbelief to outright fear, was almost intoxicating. Every slight, every insult, every attempt to diminish me over the years had been accounted for, and now the tables had turned completely. I could see the reckoning in Amanda's eyes. She had always relied on arrogance and privilege to shield herself from reality. Now, confronted with the evidence of my success, she was forced to acknowledge that she had misjudged me entirely. My parents, who had spent years enforcing hierarchy and favoritism, were equally powerless. My ex-wife's attempt to regain control, to assert that she had somehow won, fell flat. She had underestimated me once, and now she understood that any attempt to undermine me again would be futile. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout or lecture. My satisfaction came from the quiet, undeniable truth. I had risen from the lowest point, from living in a car and being humiliated daily, to standing at the apex of a family dynamic that had once crushed me. They had dismissed me, mocked me, and assumed they could control or diminish me. But every assumption had been shattered by preparation, patience, and intelligence. By the end of the night, as they left the penthouse, humbled and shaken, I finally allowed myself to relax. The tension that had built for years, the weight of resentment, the sting of betrayal, it had all transformed into clarity, focus, and empowerment. I had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was no longer the man they thought I was. I stood alone in the living room afterward, looking out at the skyline, the city lights glittering like 1,000 tiny reminders of everything I had overcome. The penthouse was mine, the cars were mine, the fortune was mine, but more than that, the respect I had been denied for so long was finally within reach. Not just from others, but from myself. And in that quiet, victorious moment, I understood something profound. The power of revenge isn't in the destruction of those who wronged you. It's in the transformation of yourself. I had rebuilt, reclaimed, and risen. I was Hunter Reynolds, and no one, no family, no ex-wife, no ridicule would ever be able to take that from me. I locked the penthouse door behind me that night, the echoes of my family's astonishment still lingering, and whispered to myself, with a calm and steady certainty, I am no longer the man you underestimated. I am the man you should have feared. I'm William, 38 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been overshadowed by my younger brother, Mark. Growing up, it wasn't the typical sibling rivalry. It was more like living under a storm cloud that followed him everywhere he went. My parents adored him. Everything he did was perfect, brilliant, or lucky. Meanwhile, I was the one who had to constantly prove myself, the one who had to fight for recognition, for respect, for even a sliver of parental pride. I tried to ignore it, tried to chalk it up to natural favoritism, but the years piled up like bricks on my chest, and eventually, I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. Mark was always charming, always slick, the type of guy who could smile at a room full of strangers and make them believe he was the smartest person alive. But behind closed doors, he had a knack for stepping on people without a second thought. He was cruel when it suited him, manipulative when it served him, and completely unaccountable in the eyes of our family. And me? I was the one who absorbed all the consequences. I learned early that standing up to him would only make things worse. It wasn't just the way my parents coddled him. It was the way the world seemed to bend for him while I got shoved to the side. The tipping point came when I was 23. I had been married to my wife, Lila, for 2 years, and things were good. Steady. Not perfect, but I had a life that I loved, a home I worked hard for, and a marriage that felt real, authentic, and mine. But Mark, true to form, couldn't leave well enough alone. I had always sensed his interest in Lila, a subtle kind of predatory charm he reserved for people who were happy without him. At first, it was small things, lingering looks, jokes that hit too close to personal boundaries, a knack for showing up at places I didn't expect him to be. I brushed it off, thinking I was paranoid. But then came the day I can't forget. I had just finished work and was heading home when Mark called. His voice was uncharacteristically warm, almost conspiratorial. "Hey, Will," he said. "I was thinking, maybe Lila could come over tonight? Just for dinner. You're working late, right?" My stomach sank, a premonition of the chaos I didn't yet understand. I told him politely that we had plans, that it wasn't a good night. But Mark had that smile, the one that disarmed everyone, including me sometimes, and he laughed softly. "Come on, she'll have fun. Don't be such a stick in the mud." I didn't know it at the time, but that night marked the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel my life. Mark had already started weaving his little scheme, targeting my marriage with precision, exploiting moments I trusted him not to. Weeks later, I noticed small changes. Lila seemed distant, distracted, almost hesitant around me at home, while her smiles and laughter seemed to appear more often when Mark was around. I asked her once, carefully, if everything was okay. She brushed it off, said I was overthinking. But I wasn't. My instincts told me something was wrong, something deliberate. The moment of absolute devastation came one evening when I returned home early from a work trip. I opened the door to laughter, Mark's laughter, and saw them. Lila sitting across from Mark, not hiding, not apologizing, just there. And then I heard the words I would never forget. "You'll never see her again." Mark sneered, his grin sharp and triumphant, like a predator who had caught his prey. I froze, my mind racing, my chest tightening as if the air itself had been stolen from the room. Lila didn't look ashamed, didn't try to stop him. She just looked at me with that same detached expression, and in that moment, I realized my life as I knew it had ended. I spent the following days in a fog, replaying every interaction, every missed warning, every laugh I had taken for granted. My parents' reactions were what I had come to expect, apathetic, dismissive, and in Mark's favor. "It's just a phase," my dad said. "She'll realize what she's done," my mom chimed, as though their words could undo the betrayal. But I knew better. I had been left not just without my wife, but without a family that actually cared enough to stand on my side. And Mark? He didn't stop there. Not only had he taken Lila, but she was pregnant within months. And the worst part? The child, fragile and sickly from birth, was now part of the twisted narrative Mark controlled, a constant reminder of the life he had stolen from me. For years, I didn't see them. 15 long years, actually. Every birthday, every milestone, every moment I wanted to share or celebrate, they laughed about it as if it were nothing. Their happiness, their convenience, their sense of entitlement. It gnawed at me, and I buried the rage deep, planning quietly, refusing to let my emotions run unchecked. I built my life cautiously, silently, with one eye always on the future, on the chance I might someday reclaim the dignity and power that had been ripped from me. And then, out of nowhere, she walked in. Not the child, not the fragile figure I had imagined, but a young woman, confident, poised, radiant with intelligence and drive. She had grown up thriving despite the mess Mark and Lila left behind. She walked into my life as if she belonged there, powerful, unafraid, and holding a secret I didn't yet understand. That moment, that was the spark. The beginning of a reckoning I had been waiting for my entire adult life. 15 years of careful planning, of simmering resentment, of being the silent observer while Mark and my family reveled in their twisted little world. All of it had led to this. 4 years after Mark's betrayal, I tried to bury my anger under a layer of routine. I built my career, my home, my life carefully, compartmentalizing the pain so it didn't consume me entirely. But nothing truly dulls the ache of knowing that someone you trusted, someone who should have been family, could destroy your happiness without consequence. My parents? They were complicit by omission, the way they pretended my heartbreak didn't exist. And Mark? He thrived on it. He always did. The first real breaking point came on a Thanksgiving years after the divorce and the birth of his daughter, Emily. I had reluctantly agreed to join the family gathering because part of me still hoped, perhaps foolishly, that there might be a sliver of decency left in them. I arrived at their house with my younger kids, trying to maintain a neutral attitude, to be the adult. But the moment I stepped through the door, I felt it, the familiar swirl of disdain and superiority that always accompanied Mark. He was hosting as usual, the center of attention, laughing too loudly at his own jokes, glancing at my family and me as if we were intruders in his perfectly curated world. Lila was there too, her face smooth, polished, and unreadable, a mask that had become her default expression over the years. She didn't acknowledge the tension at first, probably because she knew exactly how it would unfold. And then I saw Emily, his daughter, now 10 years old, sitting at the table with an expression I recognized instantly, the same calculated, measured way Mark observed the world. She was his clone in temperament, even if not in appearance. The evening started deceptively normal, with polite conversation and forced smiles. But the moment I tried to join in, the subtle hostilities began. Mark would interrupt me mid-sentence, not out of necessity, but with the casual arrogance of someone who believed your voice had no value. He'd redirect every compliment toward himself, every anecdote toward his glory, and every small success I tried to share became a competition. My kids, curious and excitable, were not spared. Every accomplishment they shared was met with condescending remarks. "Oh, that's cute, but Emily did something way better last week." Even my youngest, who was 6 at the time, asked me in a whisper if we could leave early. It wasn't just Mark's constant undermining. My parents had perfected their passive-aggressive routine. My father's eyes would flicker over me with faint disappointment, as if I was failing in some intangible way, while my mother's sighs and thinly veiled helpful advice were meant to remind me I had never lived up to expectations. Every gesture, every word, felt like a calculated push to remind me of my place, the one I'd never wanted, but had been assigned at birth. By the time dessert came around, I was simmering quietly, counting the seconds until I could finally leave. But Mark had one final trick up his sleeve, the thing that pushed me beyond the limits of endurance. Emily, under his guidance, had been given the task of announcing a special surprise for the family. I thought it might be something innocent, a drawing or a school award. I had no idea it would be a public, humiliating betrayal. "Everyone," Emily's voice rang out, loud and commanding, with a practiced poise that was unnervingly familiar. "Daddy and I have something really exciting to tell you about William." My stomach sank, because the moment she said my name, I knew it was coming. Mark was grinning, barely able to contain his smugness, and Lila was sitting quietly beside him, her expression neutral but her eyes watching me carefully. "What is it, sweetie?" I asked cautiously, trying to hide the tension in my voice. Emily turned toward me, her small hands clutching a folded piece of paper. "We've been keeping a secret," she said. "William didn't know about it until now, but it's really important. You see," she paused dramatically, glancing at Mark, who was now beaming like a proud general overseeing a perfectly executed plan. "The truth is," she said, holding up the paper, William hasn't been paying us properly for years. We've actually been saving, and now we can finally do something really big with the money he owes." The room went silent. My brain short-circuited. The words made no sense at first. My parents exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, lips pressed tightly together. And Mark? Oh, Mark's grin stretched impossibly wide, the kind of smile that only someone completely certain they had one could wear. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice low and trembling, trying to keep it from cracking completely. "You know, the money you were supposed to give us after." Emily glanced at her father. "Well, you didn't, and now we've taken care of it ourselves." She waved the paper again, as if that alone made her statement undeniable. The reality hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just humiliation. It was accusation, a public, staged moment designed to make me feel guilty in front of everyone, including my children. My parents were silent, but their silence screamed complicity. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother simply nodded at Mark as if to say, "Yes, this is exactly how it should be." I could feel every ounce of control slipping away, my carefully maintained calm starting to crumble. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure. "Emily, I don't understand. What money? When did this happen?" Mark laughed, that infuriating, self-satisfied laugh. "Oh, William, don't play dumb. You always think everyone else is as honest as you. You didn't send the inheritance you promised, remember? We've been patient, but we had to do something eventually." It was a lie, of course. I had never promised Mark or Lila anything like that, certainly not the sums they were claiming. But the way the room was set up, with Emily announcing it like an official decree and my parents silently backing him, made it impossible to respond without sounding defensive, irrational, or worse, guilty. My kids were staring at me, confused and worried, and I felt my chest tighten as shame, anger, and helplessness collided inside me. The breaking point wasn't just the lie. It wasn't just the manipulation or the years of favoritism. It was the way they had weaponized everything I cared about: the respect of my children, the trust of my parents, the stability of my life, against me. It was the realization that no matter what I did, they had perfected the art of turning every moral and emotional advantage in their favor. I wanted to explode. I wanted to yell, to scream, to throw the paper across the room, and make them feel even a fraction of the humiliation they had inflicted on me. But I didn't. I clenched my fists, took a deep breath, and left the room. Not dramatically, not in a way that would give them the satisfaction of seeing me react. I simply walked out, my mind racing, heart pounding, and a single thought consuming me. This ends. One way or another, it ends. Outside, I leaned against my car, staring at the ground, feeling both the sting of betrayal and the cold, undeniable clarity of purpose. 15 years of being pushed aside, mocked, and undermined had led to this moment. The emotional climax, the betrayal I could not ignore, the humiliation I could not erase, the family I could not trust, had finally arrived. And now, for the first time, I realized I had to stop surviving and start fighting. I didn't know how I would do it, or what it would take, but I knew one thing. Mark and my family had underestimated me for the last time. This wasn't just about reclaiming money, respect, or dignity. It was about setting things right, in a way that would leave no doubt who had truly been wronged. And I had 15 years of careful observation, patience, and silent rage on my side. The plan was forming in my mind, piece by piece. I would gather information, watch their moves, and find the cracks in their armor. I would turn their arrogance against them, their sense of entitlement into their downfall. And when the time came, I wouldn't just react. I would act deliberately, smartly, with precision. For now, though, I sat in my car, letting the night swallow me, feeling the weight of the past 15 years press down, and knowing that everything was about to change. This was the breaking point. And when I stepped back inside, I would start planting the seeds of a reckoning that they could never have seen coming. After that Thanksgiving, I felt hollow in a way I hadn't thought possible. The humiliation wasn't just public, it cut deep into the core of who I thought I was. I had always been careful, precise, and measured, but that evening had stripped me bare. I drove home in silence, the night air thick with the weight of every slight, every betrayal I had suffered since childhood. My kids were asleep in the back seat, unaware of the storm that had just erupted in my life, and I couldn't bear the thought of their innocence being touched by the bitter reality of my family's cruelty. For the first time in years, I questioned myself. Maybe I had been naive to think I could ever stand on equal footing with Mark. Maybe the world was always going to favor those who smiled and manipulated, while people like me, principled, hard-working, honest, were left to endure the fallout. I remember sitting on my porch that night, staring at the dim glow of the streetlights, and letting myself finally cry. I hadn't allowed myself that release in over a decade. The tears were hot and sharp, burning away years of restraint, frustration, and anger that I had buried beneath polite smiles and controlled temperaments. The days that followed were difficult. I went through the motions of life, but everything felt heavier. My work was a distraction, but even that offered only temporary relief. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of what I had lost. Mark's smiling face in the family photos that littered social media, Lila moving on with a life I had hoped would be mine, Emily's accomplishments broadcasted as trophies of my supposed failures. The weight of it pressed down, and I realized I had reached rock bottom. But rock bottom has a way of forcing clarity. When there's nowhere to go but up, you start noticing opportunities in the smallest details. My pride, once bruised and battered, began to stir again. Not the pride that fed my ego or competed with Mark, but a quieter, steadier kind. Pride in my own abilities, my own perseverance, my own worth. I started by reclaiming small victories. I restructured my finances, took control of my career in ways I had been putting off, and started investing in projects I had always dreamed of but postponed because I was too busy trying to maintain peace or earn recognition from people who would never give it freely. I joined professional networks I had ignored for years, attended conferences and workshops, and slowly rebuilt not just my income, but my confidence. The more I achieved, the more I felt the hollow spaces inside me fill with something stronger: self-worth, autonomy, a quiet defiance that didn't need anyone else's validation. I began exercising discipline in all aspects of my life: health, work, even personal hobbies I had abandoned. I discovered the satisfaction of seeing tangible results of my effort, the kind of deep, intrinsic gratification that no manipulation, no entitlement, no favoritism could ever take from me. Even my social life shifted. I surrounded myself with people who valued honesty, loyalty, and competence. Friends who had been there through my struggles, who never judged me for the years I had spent quietly enduring Mark's manipulations, became my closest allies. We shared meals, stories, and ideas, and I realized how important it was to cultivate relationships that were reciprocal rather than performative. The laughter, the camaraderie, the shared understanding. It was like a balm on wounds I hadn't even realized were festering. But the real turning point came unexpectedly, in a conversation with an old mentor from college. He had always seen my potential and never hesitated to tell me when I was selling myself short. One evening, over coffee, I confessed everything: Mark, Lila, my parents' favoritism, the humiliations I endured, and the gnawing sense of powerlessness I had carried for years. He listened quietly, without interruption, and then leaned back, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "William," he said finally, "you've been playing by the rules your whole life, while Mark was rewriting them as he went along. And you've survived. You've built a life from nothing, even while being undermined. That's strength. What you need now is strategy, patience, and the courage to use the leverage you've earned." It struck me then, in a way I hadn't fully realized before. Strength wasn't about fighting every battle immediately. It was about surviving, learning, and biding your time until you had the advantage. And after 15 years of careful observation, I finally had that advantage. I had accumulated resources, knowledge, and connections. I had a life of stability and respect that Mark and my family could never touch without consequences. I started making subtle moves. I researched every property, business interest, and financial foothold Mark and Lila had. I quietly strengthened my own ventures, making connections with lawyers, accountants, and mentors who could provide support when the time came. I didn't rush. I didn't act impulsively. The key was patience. Every slight, every injustice, every belittling comment from my parents or Mark, I cataloged mentally. I took notes on patterns, habits, and vulnerabilities. And slowly, methodically, I started to rebuild not just my life, but my power. Alongside the professional and financial rebuilding, I worked on myself emotionally. Therapy helped me untangle the years of resentment, guilt, and self-blame that had taken root. I realized that part of the damage wasn't just external. It had been internalized, a constant narrative in my mind that I wasn't enough. I began rewriting that narrative. I acknowledged the pain, accepted it, and then made the conscious decision not to let it define me. It was liberating, in a quiet, fierce way. My kids noticed the change. They had always been perceptive, sensing the tension between me and my family, and they responded to the steadiness I brought back into our lives. I watched them grow more confident, more secure, and it reminded me that my fight wasn't just about revenge. It was about building a legacy of resilience and dignity. Every time I felt anger bubble up, I reminded myself of this purpose. My family's cruelty had shaped me, yes, but it would not destroy the person I was becoming. The most significant shift, though, came when I started encountering Emily again. I had heard her name occasionally, of course, social media, brief mentions in the family chatter, but nothing personal. And then, by what felt like chance but was probably fate, I saw her at a networking event, a young woman in her early 20s, poised, intelligent, and commanding attention without trying. She hadn't changed in the ways I expected. She was thriving, clearly influenced by her father's manipulations, but growing into her own identity. And then I noticed it, a flicker of recognition when she saw me. Not fear, not hostility, but acknowledgement. It wasn't just that she had grown up thriving. It was that there was something else in her gaze, something deliberate, something that hinted she knew more than she let on. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew it was significant. 15 years of pain, humiliation, and carefully concealed plans suddenly had the potential for an ally, or at least, a catalyst for change. The wheels started turning in my mind, faster now, the kind of plans you can't rush but that begin to demand attention because the timing feels right. For the first time in years, I felt anticipation instead of dread. The anticipation wasn't naive. It wasn't hope that things would magically right themselves. It was strategy. It was power realized quietly, meticulously, and with purpose. I had fallen to the lowest point in my life. Yes, I had been mocked, humiliated, and discarded. But in that fall, I had found my footing, and in the rise that followed, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. I wasn't sure when the reckoning would come. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold. But I knew this. The person who had been powerless for 15 years, the person who had endured humiliation, family betrayal, and Mark's relentless manipulation, was no longer the same. The person who had cried alone on the porch, who had felt hollow and broken, had been replaced by someone who had strength, resources, and vision. Someone who would not let 15 years of mistreatment go unaddressed. With the clarity and quiet strength I had cultivated over the past few years, I realized that rushing into anything would be a mistake. The reckoning wouldn't be satisfying if it were fueled solely by anger. It had to be precise, intelligent, and unassailable. I began thinking about every detail of my life and cataloging the weaknesses and patterns I had observed for years. Mark had always relied on two things: his arrogance and the blind support of my parents. Lila, for her part, had never learned to operate independently. She was skilled at coasting in someone else's shadow, but fragile when required to take the lead. And Emily, for all her intelligence and poise, was still young, impressionable, and very much a product of Mark's manipulations. These were my pieces to move, strategically, in ways that no one would see coming. I started with small but significant steps in my own life. I diversified my business ventures, invested quietly in opportunities that offered not just profit but leverage, real influence over networks Mark and Lila had taken for granted. I reached out to old colleagues and mentors, not just for guidance, but for partnerships that could one day become crucial in asserting power over family affairs. Every connection was a thread in a larger web, a net I was beginning to weave around them without their knowledge. I had learned that subtlety and patience were more effective than confrontation. The thrill of silent power, the sense that I could act when the moment was right, became intoxicating. At the same time, I began gathering intelligence on Mark and Lila in ways I hadn't before. I watched their businesses, their social circles, and even their online interactions. I wasn't spying for the sake of malice. I was studying them, cataloging habits, vulnerabilities, and blind spots. Mark still had the same careless arrogance I remembered from childhood. He underestimated anyone who wasn't performing for him, which meant he had left gaps in his personal and professional life that were now mine to exploit. Lila, ever the social chameleon, was still dependent on his presence for confidence and validation. And Emily, as bright and capable as she was, seemed caught in a liminal space between independence and loyalty to her father. The more I observed, the more I saw the cracks in their polished facades. One of the most critical realizations I had was that Mark had grown complacent. He assumed that because he had successfully manipulated the family and everyone around him for decades, he would continue to do so indefinitely. He had cultivated a bubble of invulnerability, a world where consequences were minimal because he had convinced everyone, including himself, that he was untouchable. That arrogance was the leverage I needed. If I could operate quietly, strategically, and without drawing attention, I could exploit his assumptions and make him doubt himself in ways he had never experienced. To strengthen my position, I began forming alliances carefully, people who had been wronged by Mark in small but significant ways over the years, business contacts who had been sidelined, acquaintances who had endured his arrogance, even distant relatives who had quietly observed his manipulations. None of these alliances were overt. Nothing was shared that could be traced back to me prematurely. I was building influence in plain sight, a network of allies who trusted me and were willing to act when the time came. It was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. Meanwhile, I continued to interact with Emily cautiously, testing the waters for her awareness and understanding of the family dynamics. I didn't push too hard, didn't interrogate her, or try to force loyalty. Instead, I observed, asked gentle questions, and offered subtle guidance, all while assessing her temperament, intelligence, and moral compass. It became clear that she had grown into a capable, sharp-minded young woman. She wasn't naive, nor was she blindly loyal to Mark. There was potential there, not just for an ally, but for someone who might ultimately understand the stakes better than anyone else. I also focused on my own family, my children, ensuring that they were strong, confident, and resilient. I knew that Mark would inevitably try to exploit any perceived weakness, so I made it my mission to instill values of self-worth, critical thinking, and independence in them. Every conversation, every lesson, every small decision I made was part of a larger framework to fortify my side of the family against potential manipulation. I wasn't just planning revenge. I was creating a legacy of stability, intelligence, and control that would endure long after the confrontation. The psychological aspect of my plan became just as important as the practical side. I began envisioning scenarios, anticipating reactions, and mentally rehearsing conversations, confrontations, and negotiations. I studied Mark's patterns, the way he reacted to perceived threats, the subtle ways he tried to dominate social situations, and the moments when he revealed his insecurities despite his outward confidence. Each observation became a tool, a lever I could use to create doubt, confusion, and ultimately, vulnerability. One particularly revealing incident occurred during a casual charity gala. Mark had insisted on attending, naturally, expecting to be the center of attention. As he worked the room, laughing too loudly and monopolizing conversations, I quietly observed from a distance. I noticed the subtle eye rolls from certain business associates, the faint murmurs when he exaggerated achievements, and the way people were quietly double-checking facts behind his back. It was a revelation. Mark's world wasn't as airtight as he believed. The cracks were there, and I could exploit them carefully and deliberately. At the same time, I continued to refine my own image. I presented myself publicly as stable, confident, and successful, without revealing the quiet storm of preparation that was building beneath the surface. This was crucial. Mark thrived on underestimating me, on assuming that I was either too naive or too passive to take action. By controlling my public persona, I created a perfect camouflage for the strategy one was weaving behind the scenes. Small victories began to accumulate. I secured key investments, formed strategic partnerships, and quietly expanded my influence in circles Mark assumed he dominated. Each success, though subtle, strengthened my confidence and confirmed that I was ready for the next stage. I was no longer the powerless sibling, the victim of favoritism, or the one who absorbed humiliation silently. I had built a foundation so strong that when the time came, I could dismantle Mark's world systematically, with precision, and without exposing myself prematurely. Even my interactions with my parents became tactical. I observed their tendencies, how they aligned with Mark, and where their loyalties might waver. I knew they would resist openly supporting me. They always had. But subtle influence, reminders of past decisions, and carefully timed revelations could tilt the balance when the moment arrived. My parents had enabled Mark for decades, but I had learned that people who feel their control slipping often act irrationally. That irrationality could be turned into a powerful tool. By this point, I had created a mental timeline for my plan, though I didn't share it with anyone. It wasn't about speed, it was about impact. Every step, every connection, every observation had a purpose. The more I watched Mark, the more I realized that his overconfidence would be his downfall. He would never anticipate the patience, strategy, and quiet accumulation of resources that I had undertaken. He would assume the status quo would protect him, and that assumption would be the key to everything. Then, one evening, as I reviewed the latest financial reports and social connections, I received an unexpected email. It wasn't from Mark, Lila, or even a direct contact. It was from Emily. She had sent a short message, carefully worded, asking if we could meet privately. Nothing overt, just a suggestion. I think we need to talk. Some things you might need to know. My pulse quickened. 15 years of planning, observation, and patience had prepared me for this moment. And yet, this was a variable I hadn't fully accounted for. Emily's initiative, her curiosity, and whatever she had discovered over the years. The possibilities were dizzying. She could be an ally, a pawn, or even a complication. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had grown into someone who could influence the outcome of the coming events in ways no one had anticipated. And that meant the moment of reckoning. The confrontation I had been building toward for over a decade was drawing nearer. I sat back, staring at the ceiling of my office, letting the weight of strategy, patience, and anticipation settle over me. I had laid the groundwork, gathered the allies, observed the weaknesses, and now it was only a matter of timing. The storm I had been preparing, quietly and deliberately, was ready to be unleashed. But like all storms, the true power lies in its unpredictability, the way it strikes when least expected, leaving destruction and revelation in its wake. And I knew, deep down, that when the first move was made, there would be no turning back. Mark and my family had spent decades underestimating me, counting on my silence, my restraint, my inability to confront them with force or strategy. They had assumed that patience and cunning were weaknesses, that decency and loyalty were liabilities. They were about to discover, in the most deliberate, calculated way possible, that those very traits had become my greatest weapons. The day I had been preparing for 15 years arrived in a way that was almost anticlimactic to anyone else. But for me, it was perfect. I had spent months meticulously coordinating every detail, ensuring that every move would hit its mark while leaving no trace pointing back to me until the impact was complete. By the time I walked into the building where Mark and his family had arranged their latest high-profile meeting, the stage was set. They were confident, smug, and utterly unprepared for the storm that was about to unfold. I didn't walk in aggressively or make any dramatic announcements. That would have been a performance for their eyes, and Mark thrived on theatrics. Instead, I carried myself with quiet authority, calm and composed, the kind of presence that immediately commands attention without needing to raise a voice. People noticed my arrival not because of volume, but because of the subtle ripple in the room, an energy shift that only someone who had endured years of underestimation could generate. The meeting began as scheduled, with Mark launching into his usual show of competence and charm, highlighting achievements, laughing at his own jokes, and basking in the approval of colleagues who had long assumed he was untouchable. Lila smiled beside him, looking poised and polished as ever, while Emily sat quietly, attentive, seemingly neutral. No one noticed the subtle tension I introduced as I took my seat, nor the slight narrowing of Mark's eyes when he realized I was present and fully in control of the room. The first blow was financial. Months prior, I had quietly collaborated with a network of business contacts and legal advisors to uncover inconsistencies and vulnerabilities in Mark's financial dealings. Loopholes, mismanaged funds, and contracts that were, unbeknownst to him, strategically compromised. I opened my laptop and projected the first document onto the conference room screen, showing clear evidence of overextensions, mismanagement, and potential violations that could have severe consequences for anyone not prepared. The room went silent. Lila's polished smile faltered slightly, and Mark's confident laughter faded into a tight, uncomfortable chuckle. What is this?" Mark stammered, his voice uncharacteristically tight. He attempted to regain composure, but I could see the panic flicker across his eyes. The documents were meticulous, legally sound, and undeniable. Every line, every footnote, every irregularity had been confirmed by experts I had consulted months in advance. The evidence wasn't just damning. It was strategic, exposing flaws that Mark had counted on no one noticing, flaws that could cost him his reputation, his business, and his carefully constructed sense of invulnerability. But the financial blow was only the beginning. Next, I addressed the emotional leverage, the long history of manipulation and cruelty. I spoke calmly, detailing examples of Mark's favoritism, exploitation, and the systematic way he had undermined me over the years. I described the humiliations, the betrayals, and the reckless ways he had treated my family, all supported by corroborating evidence from emails, documents, and witness statements. By the time I finished, the room was tense, every person present grappling with the gravity of what I had laid bare. My parents, ever the enablers, were visibly shaken. They hadn't anticipated this level of meticulous preparation. Their silence spoke volumes. Finally, they were confronted with the reality of the damage they had allowed. Emily's reaction was the final, most satisfying part. I had known for months that she understood more than anyone suspected. She had grown into her own, intelligent and principled, and now she revealed what she had discovered. Her father's manipulations, the false narratives, the deceptions she had been groomed to uphold. She spoke carefully, her voice clear and steady, corroborating the evidence I had presented, and adding her own perspective on the patterns of entitlement and cruelty that had permeated their household. Mark's smugness was gone. Lila looked caught off guard, as if she had realized, too late, that their world had been dismantled piece by piece, and Emily's testimony sealed the emotional reckoning. Legal and professional consequences followed immediately. Mark's mismanaged ventures faced scrutiny from investors and regulatory bodies. Contracts he had assumed were foolproof became contested, causing delays and losses he could not control. His business credibility, once untouchable, faltered under the weight of documentation and expert validation. Lila's social reputation, tied so closely to his success, also began to crumble. Friends and associates who had previously tolerated her complicity started questioning her involvement and judgment. And Mark's carefully cultivated persona of infallibility, his greatest weapon, was irrevocably shattered. The psychological component was perhaps the most gratifying. Mark had spent decades manipulating, deceiving, and controlling, and yet the moment he faced someone who had patiently, strategically, and ruthlessly prepared, his arrogance became his undoing. He had underestimated me in every way, and watching the disbelief, confusion, and desperation spread across his face was almost intoxicating. There was no shouting, no dramatics, no confrontation that required physical force. Every move had been calculated, every piece of evidence and ally in place, and yet the impact felt total. My parents, forced to witness their complicity, could no longer claim ignorance or neutrality. Their shame was palpable. My father's expressions of disappointment, once aimed at me for perceived inadequacies, were now redirected inward. My mother's thinly veiled advice fell silent, and for the first time, I saw them grapple with accountability. They had enabled Mark, and now they were facing the consequences alongside him, powerless to intervene or redirect blame. I watched silently, observing the fallout, my children beside me, finally seeing justice unfold. I felt no need for gloating or theatrics. The satisfaction was in the precision of the plan, the way every detail aligned perfectly, and the knowledge that every slight, every insult, and every humiliation of the past 15 years had culminated in this moment of undeniable reckoning. After the meeting, as people began processing the revelations, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The cool air filled my lungs, and I allowed myself to feel the weight of relief, satisfaction, and closure. I had executed the plan flawlessly, not out of vengeance alone, but to reclaim dignity, respect, and power that had been stolen from me. I had transformed years of pain, humiliation, and restraint into a decisive, intelligent strategy that left no room for denial or retaliation. Emily joined me outside. She smiled, small but genuine, and I realized that she wasn't just a witness to the outcome. She was part of it. She had grown into her own identity, and together, silently, we had ensured that the manipulations of the past could no longer control the present or dictate the future. "You did it," she said quietly, almost in awe, and I nodded. It wasn't about recognition from her or anyone else, but the acknowledgement that we had rewritten the rules of our world. Mark eventually retreated, humiliated and defeated, his networks fractured, credibility destroyed, and influence diminished. Lila followed, her dependence on his persona exposed and her own reputation quietly unraveling. Emily, for all her knowledge of their flaws, stepped into her own space with maturity and grace, no longer bound by the shadow of a toxic family legacy. My parents were left to confront the consequences of enabling Mark for decades, their silence a testament to the years of misguided loyalty and misplaced favoritism. I returned home that evening, walking through my front door with a calm, measured sense of accomplishment. My children greeted me, unaware of the intricacies of the storm I had navigated, but sensing the quiet shift in energy, the stability and strength that now defined our lives. I realized that revenge had never been about destruction alone. It had been about reclamation, reclaiming dignity, authority, and control over a life that had been threatened and undermined for far too long. Sitting in my office later, reflecting on the culmination of years of strategy, patience, and meticulous planning, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The tension, the fear, the humiliation, and the restraint had all led to this. Mark and my family had been dismantled not through impulse or brute force, but through intelligence, patience, and quiet, deliberate action. Every insult, every betrayal, every slight they had ever inflicted had been accounted for and turned into a precise instrument of justice. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the finality of it, the gravity of the years that had brought me here, and the quiet strength that now defined my life. For 15 years, I had endured, I had observed, and I had prepared. And now, finally, justice, measured, strategic, and undeniable, had been delivered. The past had been confronted, the manipulators exposed, and the future reclaimed. And as I gazed out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I whispered quietly to myself, not in triumph, but in the calm acknowledgement of what had been achieved. I am finally free.